Some people hate small talk with a passion that seems disproportionate to everyone else. They don't just prefer to avoid it, they genuinely cannot tolerate discussions about weather, traffic, or weekend plans without wanting to claw their way out of the conversation. This makes them seem rude, antisocial, like they're bad at basic human interaction. But the truth is more interesting. They're not bad at conversation, they're bad at meaningless conversation. And there's a psychology behind why their brain rejects small talk so strongly. Research suggests that people who hate small talk often have what psychologists call high need for cognition and low tolerance for superficial interaction. Their brains crave substance. They want to understand ideas, explore thoughts, connect on real topics. And when forced to discuss the weather with a stranger, their mind actively rebels. Not because they hate people, because they're starving for meaning in a world that keeps serving them empty exchanges. There's a psychology behind hating small talk, and it has nothing to do with being antisocial, awkward, or unable to function in society. It's about how your brain is wired, what it needs to feel engaged, and why surface-level conversation registers as noise instead of connection. Psychologists distinguish between social interaction preference and conversational depth preference. You can enjoy people deeply while hating small talk intensely. The person who hates small talk isn't necessarily introverted. They might love long, meaningful conversations. They just can't stomach the surface-level exchanges that pass for connection in most social settings. And in a world where small talk is considered essential social currency, their inability to enjoy it makes them feel broken. But here's what most people don't understand. Small talk serves a function for some brains. It's a warm-up, a bridge, a way to ease into deeper connection. But for others, it's a barrier, a waste of the limited time and energy they have for conversation, a frustrating detour when they'd rather just get to something real. They don't hate connection. They hate the maze you have to navigate before you're allowed to connect authentically. The person who hates small talk has learned something frustrating about human interaction. Depth is not the default. You have to earn your way there through layers of meaningless exchange. You can't just walk up to someone and ask what they're passionate about, what keeps them awake at night, what they believe gives life meaning. Society says you have to discuss the weather first, comment on traffic, mention how busy everyone is, perform the ritual of shallow before you're granted access to substance. And for people whose brains hunger for meaning, that ritual feels like torture. They sit through conversations about nothing, waiting for the moment when it might become something. And often, it never does. The entire interaction stays shallow, and they leave feeling more alone than if they'd said nothing at all. Because loneliness isn't the absence of conversation, it's the presence of meaningless conversation masquerading as connection. There is a specific psychology shared by people who hate small talk. They process conversation differently than people who enjoy it. For them, talking isn't just sound, it's an investment of energy and attention, and they can't invest that energy into exchanges they find meaningless. Every conversation gets unconsciously evaluated. Is this worth my limited social battery? Will this lead somewhere real? Or is this just noise? When the answer is just noise, their brain disengages, not by choice, just by design. They can't fake interest in topics they find trivial. They can't light up discussing weekend weather when their mind is processing deeper questions about meaning and purpose. This doesn't make them superior, it makes them different. And in a culture built on small talk, different feels isolating. Scientific studies show that people who prefer deep conversation score higher in openness to experience, introspection, and need for meaningful interaction. They're not avoiding people, they're seeking a specific quality of interaction that small talk doesn't provide. And when they can't find it, they'd rather be alone. But sometimes the world mislabels them. You're so quiet at parties. Why are you being antisocial? You need to make more of an effort. These accusations hurt because they misunderstand the problem. It's not that they won't engage, it's that the type of engagement being offered feels empty. Tell them you want to discuss how childhood shapes adult relationships, and they'll talk for hours. Ask them about the weather, and they'll give you 3 words and a polite smile. It's not rudeness, it's selective engagement based on conversational substance. Yet many deeply thoughtful, emotionally intelligent people hate small talk. They're not socially deficient, they're conversationally discerning. They've learned that quality of interaction matters more than quantity, that one meaningful conversation is worth more than 50 shallow ones. Maybe that's the truth small talk lovers don't want to hear. Not everyone finds comfort in surface-level exchange. Some people need depth to feel connected. And forcing depth seekers to survive on small talk is like feeding someone who's starving a single cracker and asking why they're still hungry. It teaches them that most social interaction is performance, not connection. The people would rather discuss nothing comfortably than something real that might create vulnerability. Still, here's the deeper question. What is it about small talk that makes certain people recoil so strongly? Sometimes it's the meaninglessness. Their brain genuinely cannot find value in discussing topics with no depth. It's not judgment, it's how their cognitive system works. They process information by looking for meaning, connection, significance. Small talk offers none of those things, so their brain registers it as white noise. Forcing themselves to engage feels like trying to focus on static. Technically possible, but mentally exhausting and ultimately pointless. Sometimes it's the performance requirement. Small talk has unspoken rules. You have to seem interested even if you're not, act engaged even when you're bored, pretend the exchange matters when it doesn't. For people who value authenticity, this performance is agonizing. They can't fake enthusiasm they don't feel. Every forced smile, every polite, "Oh, interesting," feels like lying. And lying, even socially acceptable lying, drains them faster than silence ever could. Sometimes it's the barrier it creates. They desperately want connection, but small talk is the gatekeeper, and they can't get past it. They watch others bond over trivial topics and wonder why they can't do the same, why their brain won't let them care about weekend plans or comment enthusiastically about someone's new haircut. They want to connect, but the pathway to connection, small talk, is blocked by their own psychology. Sometimes it's sensory and cognitive. For neurodivergent individuals, small talk can be genuinely confusing. What's the point? What's the goal? Why are we stating obvious observations about whether we're all experiencing? The social rules don't make logical sense. And when something doesn't make sense, engaging with it creates cognitive dissonance and exhaustion. Sometimes it's simply preference. Not everyone processes connection verbally. Some people connect through shared activity, comfortable silence, or deep one-on-one conversation.
Small talk is verbal, surface level, and often group-based. For people who connect differently, it's just not their medium. And sometimes it's wisdom. They've learned that small talk rarely leads to the depth they crave, so investing energy in it feels inefficient. Why spend 30 minutes on weather and traffic when you could spend 30 minutes understanding someone's worldview, fears, dreams, or ideas? Life is short. Energy is limited. They choose depth over breadth. And small talk is the epitome of breadth. People who hate small talk often carry a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being surrounded by conversation, but starving for connection. They can be at parties, in meetings, in social settings, talking, responding, participating, and feel completely alone. Because the conversations happening around them feel hollow, and they can't access the kind of exchange that would make them feel seen. So they withdraw. Not because they don't want connection, but because what's being offered isn't connection. It's conversational performance, and they're tired of performing. But here's what people who hate small talk rarely hear. Your preference for depth is not a social deficit. It's a different way of connecting. You're not bad at conversation. You're good at meaningful conversation and uninterested in meaningless conversation. Those are not the same thing. You're not antisocial. You're selectively social. You engage deeply with few rather than shallowly with many. And that's not wrong. It's just different from the cultural default. Let's go deeper into the psychology behind this aversion. High need for cognition. Some brains are wired to seek complex, meaningful information. They process thoughts deeply and find shallow topics genuinely unstimulating, not just boring, but cognitively unsatisfying. Small talk doesn't activate the parts of their brain that make conversation rewarding. Authenticity as a core value. For people who prioritize genuine expression, the performative nature of small talk creates internal conflict. They're being asked to act interested when they're not, which violates their need for honesty. Energy economics. Introverts and highly sensitive people have limited social energy. Small talk depletes that battery without providing the meaningful connection that would make the expenditure worthwhile. They're spending precious resources on conversational junk food. Pattern recognition and efficiency. Many who hate small talk have learned through repeated experience that it rarely leads anywhere meaningful. Their brain has categorized it as inefficient and now resists engaging. Sensory processing differences. Neurodivergent individuals may struggle with the ambiguous social rules, the required eye contact, the expected tone modulation, all for a conversation about nothing. The cognitive load is high. The reward is non-existent. Depth as identity. For philosophers, thinkers, and introspective people, meaningful conversation is how they understand the world and connect with others. Small talk doesn't just bore them, it fails to serve the function conversation is supposed to serve. But here's the paradox. People who hate small talk often become exceptional conversationalists when given the chance, because they don't waste words, they don't fill silence with noise. When they speak, they mean it. And when they find someone who also values depth, the conversation that unfolds is rich, meaningful, and deeply connecting. They don't need to talk to everyone. They need to talk meaningfully to someone. And that's not a lower standard, it's a higher one. If you hate small talk, you already know this experience intimately. You know what it's like to dread networking events where everyone asks the same 5 questions and gives the same 5 answers. You know the exhaustion of forcing yourself through polite exchanges about nothing just to avoid seeming rude. You know the loneliness of being in a conversation but feeling completely disconnected because nothing being said actually matters. You know what it's like to meet someone and immediately want to skip the shallow phase and just talk about real things, but knowing you can't because that's weird. And you've probably been told that you need to lighten up. Not everything has to be deep or learn to enjoy small talk like everyone else. But what if you don't need to change? What if small talk genuinely doesn't serve your brain and that's okay? What if you're not failing at socializing, you're just wired for a different kind of socializing? Your hatred of small talk doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're hungry for substance in a world that often settles for surface. You don't need to force yourself to enjoy conversations about nothing. You need to find people who also want to talk about something.
And those people exist. They're just harder to find because they're also avoiding the small talk situations where most people meet. The world will tell you that small talk is essential, that you need to master it to succeed socially and professionally. And yes, sometimes you have to participate in it. Sometimes social survival requires performing the script. But participating doesn't mean enjoying it, and struggling with it doesn't mean you're socially deficient. It means your brain is wired for depth, and depth-wired brains don't run well on shallow fuel. You may hate small talk, but that doesn't mean you hate people. It means you hate the conversational barrier between you and actual connection. You don't want less interaction. You want better interaction, more meaningful, more authentic, more real. And because you're unwilling to settle for shallow, you often end up alone. Not by choice, but by standard. Because most people are content with small talk. And you need more than contentment, you need connection. There is a quality people overlook about those who hate small talk. When they finally find someone who speaks their language, who wants depth, who values substance, who doesn't need 20 minutes of weather discussion before getting real, they become the most engaged conversationalists you'll ever meet. They don't need social warm-up, they don't need conversational foreplay. They can dive straight into ideas, emotions, experiences, truths. And that directness, that hunger for meaning, creates the kind of connection that small talk promises but never delivers. So, let's be clear about something. You are not antisocial for hating small talk. You are not awkward. You are not failing at basic human interaction. You are someone whose brain requires substance to engage, and there is nothing wrong with that. You don't owe anyone enthusiasm for conversations about nothing. You don't have to pretend whether discussions fascinate you. You're allowed to find small talk boring. You're allowed to prefer silence over meaningless chatter. You're allowed to save your energy for conversations that actually matter. One day, you'll meet someone who also hates small talk. And within 5 minutes, you'll be discussing ideas, beliefs, experiences, truths. No warm-up, no script, just depth. And that conversation will nourish you more than 100 small talk exchanges ever could. Until then, survive the small talk when you must. But don't internalize the message that you're broken for hating it. You're not broken. You're just wired for meaning in a world that often defaults to noise. Keep seeking depth. Keep refusing to settle for shallow. Keep trusting that real connection exists. It just doesn't start with discussions about the weather. Because people who hate small talk aren't antisocial. They're waiting for conversations worth having. And those conversations, when they finally happen, are worth every awkward silence you sat through to find them. Your brain craves meaning. Your soul needs depth. Your conversations deserve substance. And you don't have to apologize for any of that. Small talk will never feel natural to you. And that's not a failure. That's just who you are. So the next time someone starts discussing weekend plans and your internal scream gets louder, remember, you're not broken. You're just hungry for something real in a world that often serves empty exchanges. And there's nothing wrong with being hungry for more.